Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are taking on a really powerful linguistic flashpoint. It's a single word that, well, according to our source material, it kind of acts as a global mirror.
Yeah, reflecting years, maybe decades, of accumulated cultural friction. It's quite something.
We are diving into the concept of Baizuo.
And what's really fascinating here, I think, is that we aren't just looking at the political angle of this term. We're looking at its function, how it acts as a tool for maybe cross-cultural diagnosis. We're analyzing the perspective of Lóng Tíng. He's an author, a coach, a mentor. His whole professional life seems dedicated to bridging that, well, enormous gap between East and West.
Absolutely. And our mission today really is to understand why this term, which popped up first on Chinese digital platforms, why it's become what Ting calls a cultural verdict on Western societies.
Right.
We're using his detailed analysis as maybe a shortcut, a way to understand these global communication fractures. We're trying to find the lesson in humility here.
Yeah, it's not about just repeating the critique itself, is it? It's about understanding what it reflects.
Exactly.
And Lóng Tíng, he describes his work as following the red thread of dialogue. His context is so important here. He's CEO of Lóng Tíng Enterprises, rooted in East Asian thought.
But deeply involved in the West.
Deeply involved, active in Western leadership circles. So he sees this tension firsthand, constantly.
He uses such a beautiful and really fitting analogy for how difficult this work is, doesn't he? He describes his path.
The bamboo path one?
Yes. Like a bamboo path leading toward a quiet mountain temple. It's fragile, he says, because dialogue can just snap,
Yeah.
under the weight of misunderstanding.
But it also has to be resilient, because that search for connection, for genuine understanding, it's essential. It has to keep going.
And that analogy, it really signals the gravity of what we're talking about today. This isn't a light topic.
No, definitely not. This deep dive, it's meant to be, well, humbling. An exploration of a difficult truth, maybe. And focusing, like you said, on reciprocity, not just pointing fingers.
Okay, so let's unpack this then. How does this single, pretty sharp word, Baizuo, how does it manage to encapsulate such complex East-West frustrations? And, crucially, what lesson does it offer for global humility, according to Ting's synthesis?
Well, to start, we need a bit of context. Where did it come from? The word itself, Baizuo, it surfaced on Chinese platforms around 2010, give or take.
Right. Initially sort of bubbling up in online discussions, places where people were talking about international affairs, maybe perceived Western interference.
Exactly. And it was clear pretty quickly, I think, that this was more than just, internet slang. It had weight.
It's written with two characters, right?
Mazuk, which literally just translates to white left. Pretty straightforward.
But the cultural baggage it carries, that's way heavier than a simple dictionary definition, isn't it?
Oh, much heavier. Ting notes that right from the start, the word carried this deep, almost simmering frustration. A frustration many Chinese observers felt when looking at Western societies.
Frustration about what specifically?
About nations that consistently seem to preach humanity and global connection, but in practice often seem distant, maybe superior.
Ah, the perception of preaching one thing and doing another.
Precisely. Often viewing themselves as the sort of singular model for, modern morality, modern governance, without much room for other perspectives.
So that initial frustration, it sounds less about pure political ideology, like left versus right in the Western sense, and more about this perceived self-congratulatory hypocrisy and maybe cultural distance.
I think that's a fair summary of Ting's point, yes.
Yeah.
And what's really critical, as you implied, is that the term doesn't just target everyone on the left and the West. It defines a very specific profile.
Okay, who is the target then?
It absolutely does zero in. The Baizuo critique focuses on what you might call the Western liberal archetype. According to Ting's source material analysis, this figure is often seen as highly educated, self-confident, maybe too self-confident,
Okay.
and particularly loud, very vocal in their advocacy for a specific set of causes, causes really central to the contemporary progressive movement.
And Ting gets specific about those causes, doesn't he? I remember reading, he lists things like refugees, minorities.
Yes, refugees, minorities, climate justice, gender equality. Those are the main ones mentioned.
Right. And these are, generally speaking, widely seen as noble causes, aren't they? Nobody's really arguing against climate justice in principle or equality.
Not the principle, no.
So if the causes themselves are noble, what is it about the way they're advocated for that creates this huge cultural fault line? That's the puzzle, isn't it?
That is the core question Ting tackles. And the problem, in his analysis of the critique, seems to be the perceived posture of the advocate.
Posture, meaning how they carry themselves.
Sort of. The critique suggests that the advocate's position is often detached from the ground realities of the issues they champion, and crucially detached from any real personal risk or consequence for themselves.
Ah, okay. So it's about advocating from a safe distance. That sets the stage, then, for the deeper Chinese critique itself, which, as Ting synthesizes it, sounds pretty sharp. Unforgiving, even.
It is sharp. The core of the criticism, Ting finds, is that these Western figures appear, well, fundamentally flawed in their approach. And it seems to boil down to maybe three key perceived characteristics. They are seen as naive, arrogant, and sometimes even ignorant.
Okay, let's break those down. Naive, what does that mean in this context? Because it can mean different things.
And that's a really important distinction Ting draws. When an East Asian observer in this context uses a word like naive, they're generally not implying innocence or, wide-eyed idealism. It's more pointed. It suggests a lack of grounding, a failure to understand the complexities, the necessary trade-offs, the real difficulties involved in things like maintaining stability or achieving development, especially in different cultural contexts.
So it's less, oh, how sweet, and more, oh, you don't get how the world actually works. The judgment on competence and reality testing.
Exactly. It's a critique of perceived impracticality. And this perceived naivete, according to the critique, fuels a specific kind of action, which Ting analyzes as the performance of pity.
Performance of pity. Tell us more about that. That sounds loaded.
It is loaded. The observation is that Baizuo figures are often quick to pity others and maybe eager to play the savior. That framing is crucial
Why crucial?
because it implies a kind of transactional relationship where the advocate gets moral credit, feels good about themselves by helping those they see as pitiable. Pity, in this view, is inherently hierarchical.
Meaning it sets up a power dynamic.
Yes. It almost requires the other party to remain lesser or dependent, so the Western advocate can maintain their position of moral superiority, their role as the helper.
So pity effectively replaces genuine dialogue or mutual respect. It lets the advocate feel virtuous without actually having to grapple with the complexities of the other person's culture or situation on equal footing.
That's the argument Ting presents.
Yeah.
And that savior complex, that desire to help from on high, inevitably leads to what the critique sees as the most crucial flaw.
Which is?
Blindness to consequence.
Ah, they are blind to the consequences of their words, as Ting puts it.
Exactly. And this is potentially the most dangerous aspect, isn't it? Especially when you're advocating for, say, large-scale global changes or political restructuring from afar.
How so?
Well, someone might speak very eloquently about, I don't know, sweeping humanitarian interventions or a climate policy that completely reshapes global industry, but without truly understanding or perhaps acknowledging the practical, political, or economic ripple effects these solutions might have, particularly on developing or industrializing nations whose stability might rely on very different priorities or timelines.
So what's the practical implication of that blindness, then? If you're pushing for policies that might, say, destabilize a region or maybe undermine its economic growth, all while you're standing safely on your own highly developed ground, your advocacy starts to lose credibility, doesn't it?
It certainly can.
It sounds less like genuine concern and more like, well, virtue signaling, but with potentially really high stakes attached for other people.
That's precisely the tension that the Baizuo critique highlights, according to Ting. And it ties right back to that central judgment he emphasizes.
Yeah.
They speak of humanity, but often from a position of safety and superiority.
Safety and superiority, that feels like the foundational context for the whole critique.
It seems to be. The argument is, if you're operating from a wealthy, highly stable, secure environment, your moral pronouncements might lack the same gravity they would if you had more skin in the game, so to speak, or if you were the one who had to directly manage the fallout from the policies you propose.
That phrase, safety and superiority, it feels like a key intellectual pivot point here. Because if operating from that safe distance is the core critique from the outside, well, the natural next question is, what happens when those same safe societies start turning their own ideals into maybe just window dressing?
Exactly. And this is where, as you said earlier, it gets really interesting. Because we shift from just how China sees the West
To how Baizuo acts as a kind of, what did Ting call it, a cultural seismograph.
Yes, a cultural seismograph,
Mhm.
exposing potentially deep structural contradictions within Western societies themselves.
Right. This is where the sting of the word becomes most effective, maybe.
I think so. The source material argues pretty strongly that this external critique wouldn't land so hard, wouldn't have such resonance, if it didn't also reflect some kind of internal truth, or at least a perceived internal truth.
So the critique holds up a mirror.
It holds up a mirror to the idea that, over time, many Western democracies might have allowed their highest ideals, the very foundations of their societies, things like human rights, equality, to turn into mere rituals of performance.
Rituals of performance, meaning the ideal becomes more like a script you read than a reality you live.
Something like that. The outward show remains, but the substance might be eroding.
Okay, let's break down the specific contradictions Lóng Tíng observes. He mentions 3 striking ones. First, foreign policy. The ideal is universal human rights, sincerely held. But the critique observes it sometimes becomes a tool of foreign policy.
Right, selectively applied.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, the argument is that when human rights are, let's say, weaponized, they lose their moral authority. If Nation A is heavily criticized on human rights grounds, but only when it suits Nation B's strategic or economic interests.
While Nation C, a powerful strategic ally of Nation B, gets a pass despite similar issues.
Exactly. The rest of the world sees that. They see not genuine moral concern, necessarily, but perhaps strategic maneuvering. And that visible hypocrisy immediately raises questions about sincerity in the eyes of the global community. It undermines the whole principle.
Okay, that makes sense. The second huge contradiction Ting points to involves domestic inequality. We're talking about nations that, proclaim ideals of equality and fairness constantly in speeches at international forums.
Loudly and proudly.
Right. Yet Ting observes that while equality is celebrated, at the same time, poverty and exclusion deepen at home.
Yeah, and this is a tough one. You really can't effectively preach global solidarity, the critique implies, while ignoring a widening chasm in your own backyard.
It feels like a fundamental failure of practice over proclamation, doesn't it?
That's how the source material frames it. How can a nation claim the moral high ground to lecture others on social justice when perhaps its own safety net is fraying, when housing instability is rampant or economic mobility is stalling for large parts of its own population?
It makes the global rhetoric feel, hollow, almost like a distraction from internal problems.
Or at least disconnected from them. And then there's maybe the most visceral contradiction, the third one, Ting highlights. This one involves borders, touching on the humanitarian side of the critique. Compassion is declared globally a noble, universal value.
Of course.
Yet simultaneously, often, borders harden.
The gap between talking about compassion and the actual policies towards migrants, asylum seekers, refugees.
That gap is one of the most visible, maybe undeniable contradictions for the rest of the world to see. Ting suggests this, at least.
You have the image maybe of a political leader giving a soaring speech about universal rights.
Juxtaposed with news footage, maybe from that same week, of migrants struggling at a heavily secured or sealed border.
That creates a kind of cognitive dissonance, doesn't it?
A huge one. And the Baizuo critique really latches onto that dissonance. The world sees the political will, perhaps, to seal the borders, but doesn't always see the equivalent political will to genuinely live up to the compassionate ideals being broadcast.
So the ultimate, pretty stark conclusion drawn by the source material here is that much of the West, or at least parts of it perceived through this lens, has kind of stepped away from lived humanity.
Yeah, that's a strong phrase Ting uses.
And replaced it with, slogans, branding, and moral posturing.
It's a powerful critique of what you might even call moral consumerism. It suggests that in some ways Western liberalism has perhaps commodified virtue.
Commodified virtue? How so?
Well, the implication is that it's become easier to say buy a t-shirt supporting a cause or post a really strong opinion online than it is to engage in the messy, reciprocal, long-term work of actually living justly, both individually and collectively through policy.
The performance again, instead of the practice.
Exactly. And Ting makes a crucial point here. This isn't some secret held internally within the West. In today's hyper-connected world,
the world sees it.
The global community sees this discrepancy, or at least perceives it, and judges accordingly. This isn't happening in a vacuum.
Right. And that visibility, driven by the instantaneous travel of information today, that moves us directly into the lesson this holds for global communication, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
Because when every word travels instantly, that gap you mentioned between the noble intention and the negative perception, it doesn't just cause friction anymore. It can cause massive diplomatic and cultural failure.
The whole power dynamic shifts in the digital age, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Ting really emphasizes this reality that every word travels. A statement made in I don't know, a Washington policy debate or a Brussels summit.
Is instantly dissected and interpreted in Beijing, Lego, São Paulo, everywhere.
Exactly. It's no longer just domestic rhetoric.
Hmm.
It gets interpreted against this vast backdrop of global history, current events, local contexts.
And the interpretation often completely flips the meaning, right? Leading to what Ting calls the linguistic disconnect. He uses some really precise examples to show this chasm between intent and perception.
He does. Like when a Western politician says human rights.
Okay, a fundamental concept.
A fundamental concept. But an African or Asian listener, Ting suggests, may not hear a universal declaration of inherent dignity or law. They might hear something else entirely,
Like what?
like moral superiority.
Ouch. Why that jump?
Well, context is everything. Historically, that term, human rights, has sometimes been tied to colonial projects or perhaps selectively used interventions. It can come delivered or be perceived as being delivered with a tone of condescension.
Derived from that position of perceived greater enlightenment or success we talked about earlier.
Possibly. The underlying assumption heard might be, we know the right way and we are here to teach you, rather than say, we are all struggling together toward a common, difficult ideal.
That framing makes a huge difference, and he gives another example, right? About equality.
Yes. When Western activists speak passionately about equality, whether it's gender, racial, economic,
Again, a core value.
a core value. But listeners elsewhere might immediately see what they perceive as a fundamental contradiction
Based on what?
based on observable actions. They might look at the treatment of migrants in Western countries or the history of interventionist wars or those widening domestic inequalities we just discussed.
So those visible actions or perceived actions become the primary evidence. They speak louder than the rhetoric.
Exactly. The history and the present reality can drown out the intended noble message. And Ting stresses, this gap isn't necessarily based on inherent hostility, but often on just observable reality as perceived from their standpoint. The noble intent gets lost because of the perceived negative impact or the visible lack of self-correction at home.
Okay, so Baizuo then, it crystallizes this specific, quite painful communication gap. It captures that distance between the stated noble Western intention, to advocate for justice, to be helpful.
And the often very negative global perception, the perception that this advocacy might be self-serving or performative, or just utterly blind to the consequences for others.
And this leads directly to the source's kind of mandate for global action, doesn't it? Which is
Cultural awareness.
Mhm.
It isn't just some nice-to-have decorative add-on for global policy or diplomacy.
It's essential.
It's an absolute necessity. Ting warns that without this deep awareness of how intentions are perceived, how words land in different contexts, even noble causes can sound hollow.
Right. The integrity of the message just gets lost. If the messenger lacks humility, lacks self-awareness about their own cultural baggage, their own position of power or safety.
It's a stark reminder, isn't it? Good intentions alone are completely insufficient. They might even pave the road to communication failure if they're delivered with an air of superiority or obliviousness.
But importantly, the analysis Lóng Tíng provides isn't purely critical, is it? He seems to pivot from this rather harsh verdict.
He does.
He suggests that Baizuo, even in its sharpness, carries a kind of hidden yearning. What does he mean by that?
Well, if you connect this to the broader context of, say, East Asian philosophy, where authenticity and harmony are often highly valued, the hidden yearning is perhaps for authenticity.
Authenticity in what sense?
It's the hope, maybe the deeply felt wish, that the ideals the West professes, things like justice, inclusion, peace, could actually be lived with humility, not just proclaimed loudly.
So the term, in its sort of unforgiving harshness, is almost paradoxically expressing a wish for those ideals to be real, to be internalized and practiced, not just performed.
That's the interpretation Ting offers. It's yearning for practice over performance.
Practice over performance. That feels like a fundamental philosophical desire, doesn't it? A call for the West to maybe step away from treating humanity as a kind of moral brand or a performance piece for the global stage.
And instead return to humanity as genuine, consistent practice in daily life, in policy decisions, in international relations.
And this vision, it fundamentally redefines what genuine global dialogue should even look like, doesn't it?
Completely. It means letting go of that need to be the savior we talked about. According to Ting, true dialogue, real connection, Has to be based on listening first,
Listening.
reciprocity,
Yeah.
mutual respect. It has to start from the assumption that both parties possess wisdom and probably both have flaws.
Not pity. Critically, not superiority.
Absolutely not. Those elements are like poison to genuine connection. They turn potential dialogue into just a monologue masquerading as a conversation.
So true dialogue requires recognizing the validity of the other side's experience, their perspective, and maybe, most difficultly, being willing to accept their critique of you.
That's often the hardest part, isn't it? Accepting criticism with openness. So the word Baizuo, its final function, Ting suggests, is like that cultural seismograph again. It's not just an insult, although it certainly functions as one in everyday usage online. Analytically, it reveals these deep structural fractures in how East and West perceive each other's moral authority, their trustworthiness, their sincerity.
And Ting sees a powerful dual reminder in the readings from this seismograph, doesn't he?
He does. For China, he suggests, the global conversation, even one delivered through a sharp critique like Baizuo, might serve as a reminder of the enduring need for ideals, for universal principles. Even as they understandably prioritize stability, harmony, rapid development, there's a tension there too.
And for the West?
For the West, it's a harsh reminder, perhaps a necessary one, of the danger that arises when ideals get stripped of humanity. When they're reduced to empty slogans or self-serving performances. The criticism is almost a callback to sincerity, to authenticity.
Which brings us, I think, to the most powerful and maybe the most personal section of the source material. This is Lóng Ting's own reflection on actually carrying this tension, living with it as he moves across cultural and geographic borders. He calls it the weight of the bridge.
Yes, this is where the theoretical critique becomes, deeply felt. Ting talks about his work across really disparate settings, boardrooms in Europe, university classrooms in Asia.
Different worlds.
Completely different worlds. And he says he constantly encounters this tension when discussing topics like diversity, inclusion, or even human rights. Things that seem straightforward in one context can be incredibly fraught in another.
He describes an immediate fear, doesn't he? A fear that his own good intentions might be misunderstood purely because of the cultural context he, to some extent, represents or is perceived to represent.
Exactly. When he speaks of social justice, for example, he feels he has to almost preemptively manage the risk that some listeners might only hear Western arrogance or cultural imperialism, regardless of his actual words or intent.
Wow, that sounds exhausting. It's an immediate, painful awareness that cultural filtering is always happening, often distorting the message before it even lands.
And that profound potential for misunderstanding, Hing says, leads to this unspoken question that sort of hangs perpetually in the air for him. A question that cuts right through any potential moral posturing and forces a kind of radical humility.
What's the question?
The question is, do you speak with us or do you speak for us?
With us or for us? That distinction is huge, isn't it?
It challenges everything. The assumption of representation, of authority, it demands partnership, not paternalism.
What really stands out to me there is the core personal lesson he seems to draw from navigating these incredibly complex encounters. It feels like it's a lesson about delivery, maybe, more than just content.
I think that's right. The essential lesson he shares, or one he seems to live by, is that ideals, they can't just travel alone. They're not self-executing.
What do they mean?
For them to land, to take root meaningfully in another culture, they absolutely must walk with humility, with listening, with respect for the ground on which we stand.
Respect for the ground, meaning the local context, the history, the existing values.
All of it. Ting is saying that the context, the tone, the genuine willingness to learn from the host culture is just as important, maybe even more important initially, than the ideal itself. If you just parachute a lofty ideal into a place without respecting its historical soil, its social ecosystem,
It won't take root. It'll likely be rejected or dismissed as performative or worse, as hostile.
Precisely. And ultimately, this brings him back to re-emphasizing communication's true purpose. It is definitely not about proving one's virtue.
Which is the very behavior the Baizuo critique targets, isn't it? That need to appear virtuous.
Exactly. Communication's real purpose, Ting defines, is about something far more difficult, far more constructive.
And that is?
It's about building bridges that hold weight on both sides.
Bridges that hold weight on both sides. That implies mutual effort, mutual trust.
It has to. The bridge needs to be structurally sound. Trust has to run in both directions. The West, perhaps, needs to trust the East's ability to offer profound moral critique and insight, not just dismiss it as defensiveness. And the East perhaps needs to trust the West's ability, or potential ability, to move beyond superiority and achieve genuine reciprocity.
That mutual dependence, that shared load-bearing, it sounds non-negotiable for any real progress.
According to Ting, yes, it's the only way forward.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean then? This word, Baizuo, it might initially just look like a simple, sharp, maybe unforgiving insult.
And it can certainly be used that way.
But when you analyze it through the lens of Lóng Tíng's work, his perspective, it functions as much more. It's like a global mirror, isn't it?
A pretty demanding one.
Yeah, demanding. Forcing a fundamental reassessment, really, of what humanity means today. Challenging the sincerity, the practice of anyone who claims to speak on its behalf, especially from a position of privilege or safety.
And this deep dive, it really leaves us right there with the central question that Ting poses, not just for others, but implicitly for himself and for all of us, for continued contemplation.
Which is,
What would it actually mean for us, for any society that champions high ideals? What would it mean to speak of equality, peace, and justice? Not simply to appear virtuous, not for the external validation, not even for our own self-image, but just to be truly human again.
not to appear virtuous, but to be truly human again. It's quite a thought to leave us with.
It is. It shifts the focus entirely, doesn't it? From performance back to essence.